Yourself, what level did you pick?
I chose Treason 2. The consistent, I guess, maybe motif throughout this level is the resin substance, which is an obstacle not explicitly unique to this level, but I think it only shows up in one other place.
The whale boss.
Right. So, the resin itself is something that each of the challenges in the stage is built around. And the way that it behaves is that when Mario makes contact with it, he switches into... is it swimming mode, or is it slightly different than the swimming mode? Is it a bit slower?
You know what, it's just a different thing that's kind of like swimming.
So, the way it works is that Mario basically holds in place. There's a weak gravity pull on him, but generally, if you hit the jump button, we'll do a sort of swimming type light upwards bounce. What's neat about that is that it will basically catch you out of the air. There are places at the beginning of the level you first encounter it on the ground, but it's quickly introduced on the ceiling of the stage at a height at which I think basically any jump is going to take you into it. So you see that it catches you and you can kind of swim through midair.
One thing I also noticed for this level is that there are way more coins. They deliberately put it between spikes or above the tree sap because it is kind of tricky to jump out of the tree sap, at least intentionally.
Yeah, I think that the coins are pretty consistently placed to encourage you to go in and out, which I agree with what you said is the hardest element of it, because I think that's the case in general. Something I've always observed is that jumping in and out of water in video games is like a pain in the ass. It never feels right.
Anything that changes your momentum.
Well, I think it's that it resets your momentum, but it's also that you switch to a new set of mechanics in like a heartbeat. So pressing a button immediately has a different effect than it did previously.
Yeah.
I gotcha.
So it pretty thoroughly explores what can be done with this gimmick of the stage in a way that builds on itself. It starts with just the resin, then puts enemies in them, then starts using spikes instead of enemies. So it's encouraging you to get used to needing to maintain altitude. And then it starts breaking it up so that there'll be like little blobs of resin with space in between, so that you need to jump from one to the next without touching the ground, because there'll be spikes underneath. So it's testing your ability there to enter and exit from this different state. That runs throughout the level and gives you something consistent to play against.
Does it have any multiple paths?
Yeah, there are multiple paths on a macro level and on a micro level. In individual segments where there's no actual exploration going on, there are different ways to overcome them that rely on actually interacting mutually exclusively with different elements of the stage. So an example is towards the beginning of the stage, there's a sort of descent that goes like a staircase, sort of. Mm-hmm. Except that it's a staircase of resin on the bottom and a staircase on the top. So one way to get through that is just to jump straight through the middle. It's pretty easy to do. I think if you just jump and hold right, Mario won't touch either side and will land at the bottom. But if you jump up in the resin on the top, then what you're dealing with is that altitude maintenance challenge where you are sort of mashing the button to try and stay in the resin. And the reward for that is there's a little question mark block up there, which...
I believe it's a life.
Yeah, I think it's a one-up. I know the one on the bottom, so if you decide to plunge down into the lower level, if you decide to go down, you'll encounter an enemy, but you'll also encounter a question mark box that at that point should be a fire flower for you if you've gotten the previous question mark box, which would have had a super mushroom. So there, if you take that bottom path, you'll be facing an extra enemy, but you'll also get a fire flower, which allows you to more efficiently deal with them, and that allows you to blow through the next part that is focusing more on enemies. So it's the slower route, but it's the one that ends up benefiting you. Well, I mean, it depends on how you want to weigh a Fire Flower against a 1-up, but I would say a Fire Flower is a more direct reward. There are a couple other places that appears, but that's what I mean when I say different paths on a micro level. On a macro level, there is one sort of reservoir of resin, if you want to call it, in the middle of the stage where right after the checkpoint you can either jump over like you've been doing up to this point or notice that there's no clear floor to this blob, which is something you could have picked up on earlier to get a bonus power-up, but otherwise was unnecessary. So if you notice that there's no floor here, you can drop down and there are enemies that cross the descent, so to speak, which is a unique challenge to this part of the stage where you're actually just trying to navigate down instead of trying to maintain altitude. So right there you've got a unique gameplay going on this separate path that drops you off into a horizontal chamber, like a basement. So there they give you a carrot power up, and for a second the level takes a break from its gimmick. You have that long chamber with spikes on the floor and bomb guy enemies, and the challenge there is getting across with the bunny power up. I'm actually not sure if you can do it in one long jump, but the main idea, as you can see from the enemies placed within the spikes, is that you're meant to bounce off them along the way, which is particularly difficult to do when you're using the bunny power up because you descend so slowly. That does, in a little way, play off of what the stage is doing with making you jump to maintain altitude within the resin, but it does it without placing the gimmick itself there. So it's sort of deviating in what its purpose is, like commenting more directly on what the stage is making you do than exploring the potential of a new gimmick. So once you make it through that, you get some rewards. You get another slightly more challenging part with suspended blobs, and then it reunites with the main path. One of the interesting things about this side path is that it's the only place to get the carrot in the level. Otherwise, all the power-up boxes will either give you a mushroom or a fire flower, depending on your state. So, if you do get the carrot there, you may notice from the latter part of that basement with the resin that you actually interact differently with the resin when you have the bunny power-up, because like when you're in the air and hold the jump button to hover, if you're in the resin, hovering makes you just move straight upwards. So instead of having that sort of rhythmic bouncing that Mario normally has when moving in swimming type situations, you can just hold the button and elevate. So that allows you to hang to the ceiling, which makes a lot of these segments easier, but it also, this segment dumps you off at the end of the level, so it's not like it's short-circuiting a lot of the challenge. If you have the bunny power-up, basically there's this long vertical shaft with a stripe of resin going down it, and you can ride that up like an elevator if you have the bunny power. So that's the only time you get that kind of vertical momentum in your control. So the path that leads to the secret exit is pretty much just that. You just need to have the bunny power up to make a long jump, and it dumps you out at the secret exit, which is your second branching path. The secret exit, you need the bunny power up to reach, and it's actually, just speaking strictly left to right, it's behind where the second path drops you off. So you either need to backtrack consciously, or you need to know the level and have seen that pipe previously and come back a second time to take the second path and check it out.
So this stage's identity is pretty closely tied to this one element that appears consistently throughout the stage, but not at all throughout the rest of the game, except for like that one other part.
Right, so the level really is, as I said, an exploration of what can be done with this one element. So in that sense, it's really the best of what you can get with a gimmick stage, because it's not a one-dimensional gimmick. It's not something that only behaves in one way consistently. Not only does altering the spacing and shape of these blobs of resin change the way that the level flows, but Mario in its different power-up states interacts with it differently. So it gives you feedback on all aspects of the game. All of the game's mechanics come into play in interacting with this new element, and therefore, even though it's something that only shows up in this one stage, it still fleshes out what Super Mario Land 2 is and fleshes out how those game elements come together and make a sort of interesting level.